Hi again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Today we're discussing Lesson 2 for those students who are in INRW 0399. This time we're talking about the beginning of the colonial period, and more specifically, we're talking about colonial period accounts. Okay, so this is something that equates to basically something along the lines of a diary or journal entry that comes from the colonial period. Okay, and these are more kind of a narrative on the ground, so to speak, during the time. Okay, so it's not really so much looking at the grand narrative of all the major events that happened, but more of the day-to-day life. So the term colonialism is something that we probably ought to go ahead and identify very quickly on, because you will end up running into this more than once. Colonialism is actually a system whereby you have a major world power of some kind, a government, an empire, so to speak, who ends up taking over another country and colonizing it and utilizing its resources for its own personal gain. Okay, and if it sounds sinister to you, that's because quite often it does have that kind of overtone. Okay, usually for those who are being colonized, right, the people who live in the countries that are being invaded, typically things don't go very well, right? And there tends to be a lot of long-term trauma that happens as a direct result. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second too. But some of the key features of colonialism here, okay, number one, we have a political and legal domination by some kind of imperial country, again, over another society of some kind, right, an alien society. And here we're also talking about once this imperial country comes in and takes over, they tend to completely remake the entire economy of the place that they're colonizing. Okay, and so we end up with the people who already live there, an indigenous population of some kind, who suddenly are forced to rely upon those who have come in and invaded. Okay, and so there becomes this relationship, not only economically speaking, but also politically speaking. Okay, so typically the invaders are almost like it's almost like a mafia presence, right? They come in, they beat people up, and then they force them to pay protection money, essentially, so that other major powers don't come in and invade as well. Okay, so again, it tends to be a lot more of a negative presence over time. And again, the key thing that the imperial power is trying to succeed at here is to try to actually exploit the colony as much as it possibly can, right? Any kind of natural resources it can find, any kind of new markets that it can open up, it tends to do so with extreme abandon, right? It does it without any kind of concern for the local ecology, without any kind of concern for the local cultures. And racial and cultural inequality tend to be at the epicenter of all this. Okay, so the colonizers tend to be extremely aggressive against those that they're colonizing. Okay, sometimes they will enslave them, sometimes they will turn them into servants of some kind. They will try to basically do away with the indigenous culture altogether in many cases and replace it with the colonizing culture. Okay, and over time, the British are the ones who are the most closely associated with this idea of colonialism. Okay, especially once we get into the later part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, you'll see this more, especially once you get into the second part of history. Okay, history 1302. But over time, this starts to have, again, this extremely negative impact on the culture that has been colonized. Okay, and that's where we get into the difference between colonialism and post-colonialism. Now, in terms of the colonial period in America in particular, we're talking about the period that roughly starts the same year that Christopher Columbus comes to the West Indies for the first time, right, 1492. Okay, and the end date for this, arguably here, is the year 1763. This is the year that the French and Indian War comes to an end. Okay, and so it's this is the conflict that just predates the American Revolution by about 13 years, give or take. And colonial literature, when we're talking about literature written during this particular time and the colonial accounts in particular, these are things that are being written by and from the perspective of the Europeans who are the colonizers, the people who have come to America specifically for whatever reason, right? For religious freedom, for economic freedom, for some kind of freedom from the original British government. Okay? And they're typically very, very biased by their own cultural beliefs, right? They're expecting this new world to kind of open up to whatever demands they have of it. And they also harbor a lot of very heavy religious beliefs that tend to, skew their viewpoints here. And it's primarily Protestant Christianity that we're talking about. Okay, this is kind of during and especially once we get into the period of English colonization, the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so we have various Protestant Christian sects that are coming to the Americas, and each one carries its own specific set of beliefs that are quite often in competition with one another. And Native Americans, again, tend to bear the brunt of most of the negative impact from all this. Again, this is the colonized culture here. They're depicted by the colonizers as in a very negative light, quite often as either savages, being culturally inferior, or something along those lines. And there's no love lost between the two cultures, okay? Especially over time. When it comes to the English especially, there's extreme tension at best that goes between the two groups. And it's worth noting, too, when we actually come down to specific examples of writing from this time period, literacy was not extremely widespread at this point. Okay, universities and schools did exist, but typically only individuals who were extremely influential or extremely wealthy were able to have access to that. So most of the people coming to the Americas at this point were, quite frankly, the dregs of society. Right? These were people who were being kicked out of England because the English people couldn't stand them for one reason or another. Okay, quite often the prisons were emptied and people would be put into indentured servitude and sent over. Okay, so most of the people coming to the colonies at this point were extremely poor and or uneducated. Okay, so the people that we have accounts from tend to be people who are people in charge more so than anything. Now, again, the last thing we'll talk about here is the difference between colonial literature and post-colonial literature. Okay, I mentioned this before. Colonial literature, again, is something written during the period of colonization, okay? And it's written specifically from the perspective of those who are colonizing, okay? So in other words, the people, the British in this case, who end up colonizing most of the Americas, tend to be the ones who give us the most when it comes to colonial literature. And the content of this tends to follow the process of colonization, what successes or losses these individuals have had, and sometimes, if it's a government document or something, it's the influence that the empire ends up retaining over the colonized region. Okay? And again, the people who are colonized, in this case the Native Americans, are typically depicted as barbaric or inferior somehow by the colonizers themselves. Okay? So there's a lot of heavy tension that goes on there. Now, post-colonial literature, this is the last thing we'll discuss here. This is the exact flip side of the coin of colonial literature. Okay, post-colonial literature is written often after colonization has ended, okay, and it's sometimes several generations removed, several years or decades or even hundreds of years later, or when the independence of a specific region ends up occurring. Okay? And this is actually taken from the perspective of those who have been colonized. Okay, so in other words, this is not the people who are doing the settling. This is the people who are indigenous to the area and who have been affected by years and generations of colonization. Okay? And usually it ends up showing how a native culture has gone into decline over time. Okay, what kind of abuses have been experienced at the hands of colonizers, how much society has been scarred by this in one way or another. Typically, there's a lot of power struggle that goes into this, a lot of abusive codependency, racism, and the betrayal of one's own culture tends to be one of the major themes of this. Okay, so especially once we get into the 20th century, when a lot of places in Central and Southeast Asia especially start to go back to independent status, right? They end up kicking the British or the French out or whatever. We start to see a lot of post-colonial literature come out of this, right? So places like India, Vietnam, Korea, and places like this, they start to go back into an independent status, and they have to basically pick up where they left off after the colonizers have come through. Okay, so take all this into consideration and go ahead and check out what I've got on the discussion board, and I will talk to you all next time. Thanks.